Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. In a small suburban town where everything looked safe and ordinary, one quiet man carried a storm inside his mind. Neighbors thought he was only shy, a man who kept to himself. But behind closed doors, anger and loneliness grew stronger every day. What made him finally snap? And how did an entire neighborhood miss the signs until it was too late? He looked like an ordinary neighbor. But inside, he was becoming something far more dangerous. This is the story of Daniel Harris, the suburban killer no one saw coming. The suburban town of Brooksville looked quiet from the outside. The streets were lined with maple and oak trees, and the houses stood in neat rows with trimmed lawns and white fences. In the evenings, people walked their dogs, children rode bicycles, and porch lights came on at the same time, giving the street a gentle glow. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day and believed nothing bad could ever touch them. Daniel Harris lived in one of those houses. His home was painted pale blue, with a garage that he kept tidy and a yard that was always cut short. To anyone passing by, he seemed ordinary. He was in his late 30s, tall but slightly hunched, as if the weight of life pressed on his shoulders. He lived alone. He worked at a hardware store downtown, and most neighbors only knew him as the quiet guy on Maple Street. People often noticed how reserved he was. When neighbors waved, Daniel gave a short nod and walked on. When children called out a cheerful hello, he managed a faint smile. He never joined neighborhood barbecues or block parties. When Paul and Melissa Martin, the couple next door, invited him to a cookout shortly after moving in, he politely refused. He said he had other plans, though no one ever saw him go anywhere. After that, the Martins gave him space but always greeted him warmly. From the street, Daniel's life looked normal, but behind closed doors it was different. His house was dark. Most of the time, he kept the blinds drawn even on sunny days. The living room had a sofa, a small table, and little else. The walls were bare except for a single old clock that ticked too loudly in the silence. At night, Daniel often sat in his kitchen with only a dim light above the sink, scribbling in a notebook. The pages were full of half-finished thoughts and angry words, a reflection of the storm inside his mind. Daniel had not always been this way. Years ago, he had been married to a woman named Carolyn. At first, they lived happily, but arguments soon filled their home. Carolyn said Daniel shut her out, that he never shared what he was feeling. He thought she judged him, blamed him for everything. Their fights grew worse, and finally she left. She told him he needed help, but he refused to believe her. Since then, he had lived alone, and the loneliness grew like a shadow that followed him everywhere. At work, Daniel managed to keep up appearances. His manager, Mr. Lawson, thought he was reliable. He came on time, stocked shelves, and helped. Customers find tools. His coworker, Linda Baker, sometimes tried to chat with him. She asked about his weekend, what kind of music he liked, or if he watched the game. Daniel's answers were short. He never asked anything in return. Linda felt he wanted to be left alone, so after a while, she stopped trying. Most people in Brooksville believed Daniel was harmless. Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who lived on the other side of his house, once told her daughter that he looked like a man carrying heavy thoughts. She said his eyes looked tired, as though he had seen too much. She even baked cookies for him once and left them on his porch with a note. Daniel brought them inside, ate two, and then left the rest forgotten in the pantry. He wanted to thank her, but he never did. Words felt heavy in his mouth. What no one saw was how Daniel's nights stretched on. He stayed awake long after midnight, pacing through the dark rooms of his house. Sometimes he sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the tick of the clock. Other times he muttered to himself, replaying old fights with Carolyn in his head. He remembered the things she had said, the way she looked at him before she walked away. In his mind, the pain never faded. The laughter of neighbors drifted through his windows in the evenings. Paul and Melissa Martin often had friends over, their porch filled with light, their voices cheerful. Daniel sat in his kitchen hearing every laugh, every sound, and it made his chest tighten. He told himself they were laughing at him. He convinced himself that people looked down on him, that he was the joke of the neighborhood. He wrote in his notebooks more and more. The words were messy, scrawled across the pages. He wrote about betrayal, about being ignored, about how people pretended to be kind but only wanted to hurt him. The notebooks became a place where he poured his anger, a place where his thoughts spun in circles. To him, it made sense. To anyone else, it would have looked like confusion and rage. But from the outside, Daniel was still the same quiet man, who nodded politely and kept his lawn neat. The Martins thought he was simply shy. Mrs. Green thought he was lonely. Linda thought he preferred silence. No one saw the storm growing inside him, the storm that waited for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Daniel's days began to change in small ways that few people noticed. He had once been steady at the hardware store, but now he started to miss shifts. At first it was once every few weeks, then once every few days. When he did show up, he looked worn out, his shoulders heavy and his eyes shadowed by dark circles. He seemed distracted, as though he was carrying thoughts too heavy to put down. Linda Baker noticed before anyone else. She asked him one morning if he was all right. He only gave a short nod, avoiding her eyes. She tried again, gently asking if he was getting enough sleep. Daniel answered with a simple, "I'm fine," and turned away. She wanted to press more, but something about his tone made her stop. He built walls around himself, and she could feel it. Mr. Lawson, the manager, grew frustrated. Daniel had once been his most dependable worker, but now he was late, forgetful, and sometimes simply absent. One afternoon, Mr. Lawson pulled him aside and told him that if he kept skipping work, there would be serious consequences. Daniel stood still, listening, but said nothing. His silence felt heavier than anger. Mr. Lawson shook his head, not sure. What was going on with him? At home, Daniel's world grew darker. The house was no longer just quiet. It felt like a prison. He spent long nights drinking cheap beer and staring at the blank walls. Sometimes he sat with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of the clock ticking, and the faint laughter from the Martins' house next door. Every sound pressed against him like a weight. Paul and Melissa seemed happy. Their home was bright. Their friends often visited, and their voices carried into Daniel's house. He told himself they were mocking him. He believed their laughter was not just laughter, but a way to remind him of his failures. He convinced himself they saw him as weak. His notebooks filled faster now. He wrote about betrayal, about being watched, about neighbors judging him. His words tumbled across the page, messy and sharp. The notebooks were full of anger that had nowhere else to go. They were his only company, his only outlet. One evening, Paul noticed Daniel's lawn had grown long, and the trash bins were still sitting on the curb days after collection. Concerned, Paul walked over and knocked on Daniel's door. Daniel opened it just enough to show his face. Paul smiled and asked if everything was all right, offering to help with the yard. Daniel's lips curled into a stiff smile. He said he was fine and shut the door quickly. Inside, his hands trembled. He thought, Paul was not offering help out of kindness, but out of judgment. He believed Paul was trying to remind him of his failure. His mind twisted the friendly gesture into proof that people wanted to look down on him. That night, Daniel could not sleep. He sat in the living room with the knife from the kitchen resting on the table. He told himself he needed to be ready, though for what he did not say. He thought he heard voices outside his window, soft whispers carried by the wind. He thought he saw shadows moving across his yard. He told himself that people were spying on him, waiting for him to slip. The paranoia grew each day. Even Mrs. Green, the elderly woman next door, no longer seemed harmless. When Daniel saw her standing at her window, he convinced himself she was watching him, reporting his every move. He pulled the blinds down and stayed in the dark, trembling with anger. His world narrowed. The safe routines he once relied on, going to work, buying groceries, taking the bus, became harder to manage. He started avoiding people. He went to the corner store late at night to buy beer and canned food when the aisles were empty. He kept his head down, moving quickly, convinced people were staring at him. The loneliness that once sat quietly in. His chest now grew louder, echoing in every thought. He no longer trusted anyone. Every smile felt fake. Every laugh felt sharp. Every word sounded like an insult hidden in plain sight. His notebooks became darker. Instead of lists or memories, they now spoke of revenge, of striking back, of making people understand his pain. In Brooksville, life went on as usual. Neighbors watered their lawns, children played basketball in the driveways, and porch lights flicked on in the evenings. To them, Daniel was still just the quiet man who lived alone. They had no idea that behind closed doors, his thoughts twisted, tighter each night, pulling him further away from the world they all shared. By the time spring came, Daniel's life was falling apart in ways that even he could no longer hide. He stopped showing up to work completely. At first, Mr. Lawson tried to call him, but Daniel ignored the phone. Linda Baker thought about visiting his house, but she decided against it. She told herself that Daniel probably wanted to be left alone, and she had her own family to think about. After a few weeks, Mr. Lawson replaced him. To the store, Daniel Harris was simply another worker who had slipped away. Daniel no longer cared about his job. He rarely left the house during the day. His blinds were always shut, and his trash bins stayed on the curb for days at a time. He lived off canned soup, bread, and the cheap beer he bought from the corner store late at night. Sometimes the clerk tried to make small talk, but Daniel only muttered a few words and walked out quickly. The neighborhood began to notice his absence. Mrs. Green, who spent most of her afternoons watching the street from her front window, told her daughter over the phone that Daniel looked thinner. She said his steps seemed unsteady, as though he had not eaten enough. Paul Martin also noticed. He mentioned to Melissa that Daniel had not mowed his lawn in weeks, which was unusual. Melissa shrugged, saying maybe he was going through something, but Paul frowned. He had always believed neighbors should look out for one another. Inside his house, Daniel's world grew darker and smaller. His notebooks filled with frantic writing. He no longer wrote lists of chores or simple thoughts. Now the pages were filled with angry lines that circled the same ideas: betrayal, humiliation, and revenge. His handwriting scratched deep into the paper, the words running together in a storm of ink. He thought about Carolyn almost every night. He replayed the day she left, her voice telling him he needed help, the look in her eyes as she packed her bags. In his mind, she had been the first to betray him. He told himself she had poisoned how others saw him, that even his neighbors judged him because of her. The memory twisted tighter each time he thought about it, until it felt like truth. Though Martin's laughter cut through his walls more sharply than ever. On warm evenings, their voices floated from their porch as they talked with friends. To anyone else, it was ordinary. To Daniel, it was unbearable. He told himself they were laughing at him. He believed they were mocking his loneliness, his failure, his broken life. He sat in the dark, clenching his fists, whispering that they would see one day. Sometimes he walked around the neighborhood at night. He kept to the shadows, his steps slow and quiet. He stared at the glowing windows of other houses, imagining the conversations happening inside. He thought every word was about him. He thought every laugh was meant to hurt him. As he walked, he whispered to himself, his words lost in the night air. People who saw him thought he was only a man taking a late walk, but inside his mind the world was no longer safe. The line between reality and his thoughts grew thinner each day. Even the smallest things became twisted. A car slowing down at the corner felt like someone watching him. A knock on a neighbor's door felt like a warning. A shadow cast by a tree looked like a figure waiting for him. His heart would pound. His palms would sweat, and he would rush back to his house, slamming the door shut and locking it quickly. One afternoon, Mrs. Green waved at him from her porch. She called out, asking how he was doing. Daniel froze for a moment, then gave a stiff nod and walked inside without answering. Behind his closed door, his chest burned with anger. He convinced himself that she had not been kind, that she was trying to get information about him, that she was part of whatever plan others had against him. The thought stayed with him for hours, turning in his head like a knife. Daniel's nights became longer. He often sat at his kitchen table with the knife resting beside his notebooks. He told himself it was for protection, though no one had ever threatened him. He thought he heard whispers outside his window, faint voices in the dark. Sometimes he believed he saw shadows moving in the yard, shapes that disappeared when he blinked. He convinced himself that people were planning something, and that he had to be ready. In Brooksville, life went on as usual. Children played basketball in driveways, families shopped at the grocery store on weekends, porch lights flickered on at the same time each evening. To them, Daniel was still only the quiet man who kept to himself. Some thought he was odd, but no one thought he was dangerous. They did not see the storm that had taken over his mind, a storm that was growing stronger every day. The breaking point did not come suddenly. It built slowly, piece by piece, until Daniel could no longer carry the weight. He had been drifting for weeks, caught between silence and anger, but on one rainy evening, everything began to tip. That day had already gone badly. Daniel had forced himself to leave the house to buy groceries. He walked through the aisles with his hood pulled low, avoiding the eyes of others. Linda Baker happened to be in the store. She spotted him near the canned goods and gave him a gentle smile. "Hey, Daniel," she said softly, trying to sound friendly. "Haven't seen you in a while. You doing okay?" For a moment, Daniel froze. He looked at her, but instead of hearing kindness in her voice, he heard judgment. He thought she was mocking him in front of strangers, showing pity like he was some helpless man who could not manage his own life. His face grew red, his hands shook, and his voice came out harsher than he meant. "I'm fine. Just leave me alone," he snapped. Other shoppers turned to look. Linda stepped back, startled, and quickly walked away. Daniel stood in the aisle, his chest tight, his mind racing. He felt the stares of everyone around him, even though most had already turned back to their own business. To him, the whole store was whispering, mocking, laughing at his outburst. He left without buying anything. By the time he reached home, the rain had started. He threw off his jacket and sat in the living room, his clothes damp, his hands trembling. He replayed the moment, over and over, convincing himself that Linda had humiliated him. He thought about Paul and Melissa, how their laughter had carried into his house again the night before. He thought about Carolyn, her voice telling him he needed help before she walked away. Every memory, every sound, every face blended together, until all he could feel was rage. Daniel pulled out one of his notebooks. His pen moved quickly, scratching across the page. He wrote that people were against him, that no one respected him, that they all wanted to see him fail. He wrote that he had been patient long enough. The words grew darker, sharper, more frantic. He wrote that they would regret underestimating him. The storm outside grew louder. Rain tapped against the windows, thunder rolled in the distance. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his notebooks scattered around him. His breathing was heavy, his thoughts spinning. He stood up suddenly, walked into the kitchen, and opened the drawer. Inside lay a long kitchen knife, its blade catching the dim light. He picked it up and stared at his reflection in the steel. His eyes looked unfamiliar to him, cold and distant. For a long time he stood there, gripping the knife. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts. He whispered to himself that this was the only way, that no one listened to him, that no one cared. He told himself that once they saw what he could do, they would understand his pain. Hours passed as he sat in the dark, with the knife resting on the table. The rain slowed, but inside the storm only grew stronger. He imagined voices outside, whispers calling his name. He thought he saw shadows moving across his yard. He felt as if the world had already decided to push him into a corner, and now he was finally ready to push back. Paul Martin next door noticed the lights flicking on and off in Daniel's house that night. He mentioned it to Melissa, saying maybe they should check on him. Melissa shook her head, saying it was probably nothing, but Paul frowned. He had a bad feeling. He looked out the window again, but the blinds were already shut. Inside, Daniel's thoughts had hardened into something dangerous. He no longer felt uncertain or afraid. He felt certain, as though a decision had been made for him. His notebooks lay open, pages filled with angry words that now looked like a plan. He convinced himself he had been forced into this, that his actions would not be his fault but the fault of everyone who had pushed him to the edge. When the storm finally ended, the neighborhood fell quiet again. Porch lights glowed softly, and the street looked calm. But inside the blue house on Maple Street, the calm was gone. Daniel had crossed a line in his mind. What began as whispers of anger had now turned into a voice that told him what to do. He held the knife tightly and told himself he was ready. The night was quiet when Daniel finally stood from his chair. Hours had passed since the storm, but inside his chest the thunder still rolled. His hand tightened around the knife he had kept on the table. He whispered to himself that he had waited long enough that no one cared about him, that everyone had turned their backs. In his mind, he believed the Martins were at the center of it. Their laughter, their kindness, their bright home, all of it burned inside him as proof that they had what he had lost. On Maple Street, the houses rested under the soft glow of porch lights. Most of the town was asleep. Daniel stepped outside into the cool night air. The street was wet from the rain, and the pavement reflected the orange light from the lamps. He walked across his yard slowly, his steps careful, his eyes fixed on the Martins' house. He told himself this was not an act of cruelty but of justice, something the world had forced him into. Inside their home, Paul and Melissa were winding down for the evening. The television played softly in the background while Melissa washed dishes in the kitchen. Paul sat at the table, reading through some papers for work. They did not hear Daniel step across the porch. They did not hear the door ease open after he forced the lock. The sound of the rain dripping from the gutters masked his entry. Daniel moved quietly through the hallway, gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short bursts, but his mind was clear in a way it had never been before. Every doubt, every hesitation was gone. His anger carried him forward. Melissa turned when she heard a sound behind her. At first she thought it was Paul, but when she saw Daniel standing in the kitchen doorway, her body froze. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Paul stood up quickly, confused, asking what was going on. Daniel stepped forward without answering. The scene that followed was fast and chaotic. Paul tried to move between Daniel and Melissa, but Daniel's rage was unstoppable. His mind no longer saw neighbors, only enemies. The screams broke the silence of the night, echoing through the street. Lights flicked on in nearby houses. Mrs. Green, half asleep, looked out her window and saw shadows moving inside the Martins' home. She could not understand what was happening, but fear gripped her immediately. She reached for the phone with, shaking hands. The flashing lights of police cars arrived minutes later, sirens breaking the calm of the neighborhood. Officers rushed into the Martins' home and found the scene that would haunt Brooksville forever. Neighbors gathered outside, holding their robes tight against the night air, whispering in shock and disbelief. No one could understand how the quiet man from next door could have done something so violent. Daniel did not run. He stood still when the officers found him, the knife still in his hand. His breathing was heavy, his clothes marked with the chaos of what he had done. His eyes looked empty, as if the storm inside him had burned out, leaving only silence. The officers shouted at him to drop the weapon. Slowly, almost calmly, he let it fall to the floor. Paul and Melissa's home, once filled with light and laughter, had turned into a place of horror. The safe suburban street where children once played and neighbors waved now stood under the weight of flashing red and blue lights. People whispered to one another, asking how no one had seen the signs, how a man they thought was only quiet could carry such rage inside him. As the police led Daniel out in handcuffs, Mrs. Green watched, from her porch, tears running down her face. She remembered the cookies she had baked for him, the way he had nodded but never spoken. She whispered to herself that maybe she should have tried harder. Maybe she should have said more. But deep down, she knew his darkness had grown too strong for anyone to stop. The neighborhood of Brooksville would never be the same. The image of flashing lights on Maple Street, the memory of screams cutting through the night, and the knowledge that evil had lived quietly among them would stay forever. The man they thought they knew had snapped, and nothing could take that night away. The news of what happened on Maple Street spread through Brooksville like a fire. By the next morning, everyone in town knew. People whispered in grocery stores, at gas stations, and even in the school parking lot. The story shocked them all. How could Daniel Harris, the quiet man who mowed his lawn and nodded politely, be the one responsible for something so terrible? Detectives arrived early to investigate. The Martins' house, once warm and welcoming, was now sealed with yellow tape. Officers moved in and out, taking pictures, collecting evidence, and speaking in hushed voices. Detective Karen Hill, a woman known for her calm presence, led the case. She stood on the porch, her notebook in hand, looking at the house with a heavy heart. She knew from the moment she stepped inside that this was not just a crime, but a tragedy that shook an entire community. Neighbors gathered in small groups, some crying, some simply staring at the Martins' house. Mrs. Green told the detectives what she had seen from her window, her voice trembling. She described the shadows moving inside and how she had called the police as soon as she realized something was wrong. Paul's brother arrived later, grief etched on his face as he tried to understand what had happened. Detective Hill and her team went next door to Daniel's house. The blinds were closed, the rooms dim, and the air heavy with silence. They searched carefully, moving through the house step by step. What they found gave them a glimpse into his mind. Notebooks were stacked on the kitchen table, filled with page after page of angry words. The writing was messy, dark, and repetitive. Phrases like, "They laugh at me," "No one listens," and "They will see," were written again and again. Some pages looked like they had been pressed so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper. To Detective Hill, it was clear that Daniel had been lost in his own storm for a long time. In the bedroom, they found unopened letters, some addressed to Carolyn, his ex-wife. Old photographs were tucked away in drawers, showing a younger Daniel with a faint smile that seemed far from the man they had just arrested. It was like looking at two different people, the man he once had been and the man he had become. At the police station, Daniel sat in an interrogation room. His hands were cuffed, but he did not resist. He stared at the table, his eyes empty. When Detective Hill entered, she sat down quietly, giving him time. For a while, he said nothing, only breathing slowly as if he were somewhere else in his mind. When he finally spoke, His voice was flat. He said he had no choice. He said people had been laughing at him for too long, that they thought he was weak, and that no one cared. He described how he had felt surrounded, trapped in a world that wanted to crush him. He did not cry, and he did not sound angry. His words came out calm, almost cold, like he believed every thought was the truth. Detective Hill listened, writing down every word. She had worked many cases before, but the way Daniel spoke unsettled her. She could see that in his mind, this was not madness, but logic. He had built a reality where violence seemed like the only answer. It was chilling because of how ordinary he looked sitting there, speaking in a quiet tone about something so violent. Psychologists were later brought in to evaluate him. They said Daniel had carried years of untreated mental illness, layers of paranoia, anger, and loneliness that had finally pushed him to the edge. They explained that people often miss the signs because they are hidden behind polite nods, quiet smiles, and neat lawns. To the outside world, he was only shy. Inside, he was falling apart. The town of Brooksville struggled with the aftermath. Neighbors who once left their doors unlocked now double-checked the locks each night. Parents held their children closer, warning them never to wander too far. People who had once waved at Daniel from across the street now avoided even mentioning his name. The Martins' home, once full of life, stood empty, a reminder of what had been lost. At night, Mrs. Green sat by her window, staring at the quiet street. She thought about the times she had seen Daniel walking home with his canvas grocery bag, his steps slow, his shoulders hunched. She remembered the cookies she had baked for him and how he had nodded but said nothing. She whispered to herself that maybe she could have done more, but deep down, she knew the storm inside him had been too strong for anyone on Maple Street to stop. Detective Hill wrote her report carefully, noting the evidence, the journals, the interviews, and Daniel's words. She knew the case would move through the courts, but the truth of what happened would never be fully understood. What made him snap? That question echoed in her mind as she closed her notebook. Sometimes there are no simple answers. Only the quiet realization that pain left untreated can grow into something unimaginable. The investigation revealed the facts. The notebooks showed his paranoia. The neighbors gave their statements. But for the people of Brooksville, the facts did not heal the wound. The safe neighborhood they believed in had been broken, and though life would go on, the memory of flashing police lights on Maple Street would remain with them forever. Daniel Harris sat in a cell, the walls plain and gray, the air heavy with silence. He did not fight the arrest, and he did not try to deny what had happened. Each day passed in slow rhythm. Breakfast trays, head counts, the distant echo of voices in other cells. To most, the cell was punishment. To Daniel, it was simply another quiet room, no different from the house where he had spent years alone. He stared at the floor for hours, lost in his thoughts. When questioned again by detectives, he repeated the same words. He said he had no choice. He said the laughter never stopped, the whispers never ended, and that he had been pushed too far. His voice stayed calm, his face expressionless. It was as though he had built a world in his head where everything made sense, even if it made no sense to anyone else. Psychologists noted that he spoke with certainty, as if he believed every thought without doubt. The town of Brooksville tried to heal, but the wound was deep. Paul and Melissa Martin had been loved by many. Their absence was felt in every corner of the neighborhood. Friends left flowers on their porch. Children who used to wave at Paul when he fixed his car now walked past the empty driveway in silence. The bright house that once hosted barbecues and laughter now stood quiet, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with grief. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Some admitted they had always found Daniel strange but never dangerous. Others said they had tried to reach out to him, but he had pushed them away. Everyone asked the same question: how could they have missed the signs? How could someone living just a few steps away have carried such darkness? Mrs. Green struggled the most. She often sat by her window, staring at Daniel's house, which was now sealed and empty. She remembered the small nod he had given her that day she left cookies on his porch. She told her daughter she wished she had tried harder, that maybe, if she had knocked on his door more often or spoken to him longer, things might have been different. But deep down, she knew the storm inside him had been growing long before anyone could have stopped it. Detective Karen Hill attended the Martins' memorial. She listened as friends spoke about their kindness, their laughter, and the way they always made others feel welcome. She stood at the back, her notebook tucked away, and thought about the quiet house next door where Daniel had lived. In her mind, the two houses told the story of Brooksville, one full of light, the other full of silence. She knew people wanted answers, but she also knew there were none that could satisfy the pain. In court, Daniel appeared calm. He did not look at the crowd, and he did not speak except to answer simple questions. His notebooks were brought as evidence, their pages filled with anger and confusion. The words shocked many who read them. They showed how his mind had twisted over time, how loneliness and paranoia had built a world where he felt hunted even when no one was chasing him. The psychologists explained that untreated illness, isolation, and years of resentment had consumed him. They said his thoughts were not sudden, but had grown slowly, hidden beneath the surface until they finally snapped. It was not an excuse, but an explanation. Still, for the families and neighbors sitting in the courtroom, no explanation could erase what had happened. The verdict was reached, and Daniel would spend the rest of his life behind walls. Some felt justice had been served, but many walked away with heavy hearts. Justice did not bring Paul and Melissa back, and it did not erase the fear that now lingered on Maple Street. As months passed, the neighborhood changed. People who once felt safe now checked their locks twice. Neighbors who once waved casually now looked more closely at one another, searching for signs they might have missed before. The street looked the same, but the sense of trust had been broken. Children asked their parents why Mr. Harris had done what he did. Parents struggled to explain, using words too simple to capture something so complex. Daniel remained in his cell, living each day in silence. He did not write in notebooks anymore. He did not ask for visitors. He simply sat, staring at the same walls. When guards passed by, he sometimes whispered words too soft to understand. Some thought he was praying. Others thought he was only speaking to himself, as he had done for years in his dark house. Detective Hill wrote the final page of her report months later. She closed it with a line that captured the truth. Sometimes the question of what makes a person snap has no single answer. It is a mixture of pain, loneliness, anger, and silence that builds until it finally breaks. She placed the report on her desk and looked out the window at the quiet street outside, knowing Brooksville would carry the memory forever. The story of Daniel Harris became more than a crime in a small town. It became a reminder that darkness can hide in ordinary places, that a quiet smile can cover storms no one sees, and that sometimes the most dangerous battles happen inside the mind. The neighbors of Brooksville learned this too late, and the cost was more than they could bear. On Maple Street, the houses still stood in neat rows, the lawns still trimmed, and the children still played. But when the sun went down and the porch lights flicked on, people remembered the night the quiet man next door finally snapped. And though time moved forward, the question lingered in every shadow. What made him snap? You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.